Hello there, welcome to Planet America's Fireside Chat. I'm John Barron.
And I'm Licciardello.
Coming up this week, Kamala Harris under fire for ducking the media. Does she owe it to voters to meet the press?
Meanwhile, Donald Trump's being criticised for talking too much. Our guests this week, Benjy Sarlin from Semafor and Republican Strategist Ying Ma. But first...
It seems like about 7 years, but this week marks 4 weeks since Joe Biden ended his re-election campaign and endorsed Vice President Kamala Harris. It's close to 2 weeks since she formally became the Democratic nominee, and yet she still hasn't given a single interview. And criticism from both journalists and the Trump camp is growing. So, what's going on? As Politico recently reported, Harris's top communication aides are deeply sceptical, as Biden's inner circle was, that doing big interviews with major TV networks or national newspapers offer much real upside when it comes to reaching swing voters in particular. And the fact is, she's already on a roll. Her rallies are going off like rock concerts. She's a star on social media and rising in the polls. So why would she risk trampling all over her own positive news cycle with the risk of a bad answer to a tough question? Although she did sit down for a chat with her own running mate, not exactly hard-hitting stuff, but at least one interesting thing came out of it. Remember that video announcing Tim Walz was her running mate last week, where she called him up on the telephone? Turns out it didn't exactly go that way.
I
was
called
hoping
you,
maybe
Tim.
we wouldn't have to.
I called you, Tim.
Yes.
You didn't answer, Tim.
I know.
What happened?
The most important call of my life. It popped up, and we didn't recognize the caller ID, and it went to voicemail.
Hi, this is Jim. I'm not able to answer.
There you go.
Responsible. Thank you.
Hey, Tim, it's Kamala. I really want to talk to you.
See, that's good. They should release that
Absolutely.
last week. We were mocking how fake that video was
Yeah.
last week. That's so much better.
And great use of social media this week, but it also, you're right, makes them look like they're a little bit phony last week as well. But Harris is answering another criticism as well, that she has yet to unveil any significant policies. And she's, well, started to do that with a major economic speech today, offering a plan which would have tax incentives for builders to construct 3 million new homes for first home buyers, so going for a very populist young demographic there. But it does leave the question, okay, it's okay to have these big announcements of policies and these rallies that are going very, very well. There's been more than half a dozen of them in the last week, and some internet videos like that where she's talking to her own running mate. But does she have a responsibility to speak to the established media, whether it's to take questions on the tarmac for more than 71 seconds, as she did this week, or to sit down with George Stephanopoulos or Lester Holt or Martha McCallum and take a bunch of tough questions? Is she duty-bound to do it, or can she communicate however she wants?
Well, like I said on Wednesday, she obviously has got to do it at some point in time. I think she should get some slack for the first few weeks of her campaign while she's coming up with her policies. She didn't know that she was going to be running for president until a month ago. So you expect a bit of time for her to know what her positions are, that's okay, and to organise her campaign, all that kind of stuff. But we're getting to the point, by the time people are voting in, mail-in voting in a month's time, they need to know what she believes. So I think she's running out of time. I think this week is basically as late as it should go. In her convention, she needs to be saying what she believes in.
The answer to that from the Harris campaign would be, presumably, well, if you want to know what she believes in, look at her rallies. Come to a rally, watch it on YouTube, look at the highlights on cable news. You don't need to have gotcha questions from reporters trying to generate a new news cycle to tell people what you really believe.
There's no details in those rallies. It's the details that matter, and the journalists tweeze out the details with their questions. Now, look, don't get me wrong. I'm aware that Trump is hassling her because she's running a small target strategy on him, and he's frustrated that he has nothing to attack. So he's hoping she will slip up so he can attack her. I get that. But at the same time, she has to say something at some point in time. We should say so. We should say, though, just to take a step back, the way this normally goes, she did not invent the small target strategy. And here in Australia, we are very familiar with the small target strategy during election campaigns. And here's how it works. what happens is if you're a new leader, which also we are familiar with in Australia, and you haven't been defined yet, and you try and fly under the radar, your opponent defines you with their own advertising and their own commentary. It's up to Trump to fox her out by defining her so she has to talk.
Yeah.
But he's not doing that because right now he's flipping out like a nut. He's talking about AI photos and he's talking about, is Joe Biden going to come back from the dead? He's talking about everything but a disciplined attack on Kamala Harris. Now, if he spent the last 3 weeks going left wing, left wing, left wing, left wing, she believes in fracking banning, this, that, and the other, all from 2019, she would be forced to combat that by running her own ads and by conducting interviews. But he's not forcing her to conduct those interviews because he's been so loose and undisciplined himself. So that's part of the problem.
Yeah. And I would also point out that Trump is the exception rather than the rule when it comes to candidate willingness to speak to the press. Trump is unique in the sense that he is both the most available, the most likely to call up on the phone into Fox and Friends. In the old days, it was going to be, Morning Joe. He does lots and lots of media when it suits him, but he is also, demonstrably dishonest when he does so. So he's available, and he's available to say things that are not true. And it's a strange standard that is applied to Trump, and there's this expectation that, of course, we know that he, told 20,000 lies when he was president. The fact checkers made a lot of it, and it made no difference to voters at all. Whereas, anyone, and I've covered a few campaigns in the United States. I have been a part of a press pack that is following a candidate like Hillary Clinton around. You don't get to ask her questions. This is back in 2008 and 2016. You don't get to ask the candidate for the presidency questions. You're there to take pictures of them, meeting with regular people. You are literally held behind a rope. In Hillary's case, colour coordinated with the shirt she was wearing. There's this rope that hog-tied 50 reporters dragging you back so that you couldn't ask questions, but you could get photographs that they wanted to show. And there are very few candidates. Biden was one who you could actually approach and ask questions to. And that could be part of the reason why he had this reputation for being gaffe-prone, because he would actually talk to you. Obama did not talk to the travelling press corps. Occasionally a question, when they were doing retail politicking in the primary states, but there was no access. There were town hall events, and then there were the big set-piece interviews, the kind of the landmark, you do your introductory piece on 60 Minutes where they get to know you kind of thing. But it's a bit of an illusion that there's usually access to a candidate. It hasn't really existed, as I noted the other night, since Walter Mondale in 1984, when the press would ask, he would talk to the press every day. Every single day he would talk to them. Maybe John McCain in 2000 as well. And they both learned that doesn't get you anywhere. You don't get any gratitude from the press. You get dragged into news cycles that you don't want to be a part of, commenting on issues that you don't care about. You don't control the narrative, and you allow the media to define what is a story and what is not, and you lose focus in your campaign.
I've got two things to add to this. The first of which is to support something you said, and then the other is to argue with you.
Sure.
To support you...
That means you're half right.
To support you, I think you make a great point that Trump is the proof positive that the more you talk does not necessarily mean the more information you get.
Right.
The more Trump talks, the more he gets on both sides of every single issue. Well, not every issue, but most of them. And so that does not inform people at all when he does that. But where I'd argue with you is, yes, that's true that when you get to August or September, presidential candidates aren't sitting around in front of a pizzeria having a chat to the press. But you know what? They don't need to, because they just had a primary where they did that for 4 months.
Yeah.
Kamala Harris did not do that. She skipped all that process entirely. And so not only has she never talked to the press as a presidential candidate, a real presidential candidate, but on top of that, she has no policy as well, which was also developed during normally the primary campaign. So it's really on her even more so to speak. And people would expect that. And I think people would start feeling ripped off. If she didn't soon, they'd feel like she's pulling the wool over their eyes, trying to hide something from her, and that would backfire in a big way.
I'll be interested to see if this is still a story in 2 weeks from now, or whether this is just that 1 week interregnum between the VP announcement and the Democratic convention. there was the first lull in the news cycle to an extent that we've seen in a couple of months, really, since the debate. And maybe this is just a bit of a silly season conversation, or maybe the narrative gets set. But either way, the first debate is on the 10th of September. She needs to be ready, because that is basically an on-stage interview, while Trump is also being interviewed on stage by a bunch of reporters. And she has to be on top of her policies by then. So she's got a lot of prep to do in the next couple of weeks on policy and preparedness to answer those questions. So I imagine this issue goes away, but there are some other media-related issues that maybe won't, because the role of the media is under intense spotlight this week as well, because we've heard that a couple of publications, including Politico magazine, have been sent a vetting dossier all about JD Vance that was apparently hacked from the Trump campaign. It was sent to the media outlets by somebody who was calling themselves Robert, who is in fact suspected of being an Iranian hacker, possibly attached to the Iranian intelligence services. But unlike back in, say, 2017, when media outlets published that so-called Steele dossier containing unproven allegations about Donald Trump, or those hacked DNC emails that were given to WikiLeaks and then released into the media damaging Hillary Clinton in 2016, this time, Politico and others are basically sitting on this material over concerns about foreign election interference. So they're turning this into a bit of a virtue, Chaz, although they do also acknowledge that there's nothing really new in any of this dossier. It's all publicly available information. So the question is, are they being virtuous, or are they basically saying it's not a good enough story to run? Yeah,
the Washington Post basically admitted that the leaks are too boring, essentially. And if I was JD Vance, I'd be very offended by that. Come on, my dirt's good enough to report on. I think most of this dirt was publicly available anyway. Mm-hmm. And so I don't think it was nearly as enticing as the Hillary campaign emails back in 2016. But I mean, it doesn't mean there isn't a lot of hypocrisy going around at the moment. Like for Trump's spokesperson to be saying, you can't report on this because it will be helping our enemies because it's hacked material. You just go, well, hang on, where were you in 2016, mate? Like when there was I love WikiLeaks every 5 seconds.
What if it was really salacious stuff about JD Vance? If it came to them from a suspected Iranian hacker, as opposed to coming to them from opposition research, would that make a difference journalistically as to whether they should publish it or not? Is it in the public interest to know? Let's just say that the couch story is true. If that had come up in Oppo research, we've heard this rumour, should they then be able to report on it either way, or should they say no, it's not in the national interest because the leak came from Iran? If
you're asking from an ethical point of view, my personal view, for what it's worth, not that I'm a journalist, is that it depends on how newsworthy it is. When I say newsworthy, I don't mean interesting, I mean newsworthy, like public interest worthy. Like if it's a couch type rumour, then that's not public interest worthy. So they shouldn't be reporting on that, in my view, if it's come from a hack. But if it's something about corruption or something about the defence industry or something else, something that's actually serious, then I think they should. I don't think I was saying this in 2016. Like I'm actually being consistent here. Back in 2016, when the WikiLeaks stuff was coming out with Hillary, I was saying most of this is trash, but there are probably 15 or 20 emails here that are legitimate public interest stories and should be reported for that reason. And so I just think there's a higher bar when it's been hacked, essentially.
The reality is, of course, that a lot of the information that journalists get are leaks from people who wish the target of the leak no good at all.
Yeah.
So it's all oppositional in a sense, but then there's a question of, are we all on the one side beyond the borders of the United States or not?
Well, we're not.
Well, clearly they're not anymore. But this is going to be interesting to see, because if the stories of hacking of both the Trump and the Biden campaigns, if there was more to it than just a bit of Oppo research that was gathered in a hurry about JD Vance or Marco Rubio or somebody, if there's more to come, then it could be 2016 all over again, but this time it's the Iranians rather than the Russians that are doing it.
All I would say about this is that it's interesting, though, maybe slightly ironic, that if back in 2016 the Trump campaign had been a bit more scrupulous with the way they dealt with the leaks, I mean, they were going to get reported anyway because they were in the public domain.
Yes.
So it's one thing when it's not in the public domain like it is at the moment, or versus when they're out already. But if they hadn't relished these leaks quite as much as they had, then maybe they wouldn't, a precedent wouldn't have been set, and now people wouldn't be so blasé about revealing leaks if it's worth publishing. So they might have made a rod for their own back 8 years later, potentially, if something juicy comes out from Iran in the next few months. But my personal view is, once again, it comes down to public interest.
Yeah, indeed. There are a number of questions this week that go to sort of the question of media practice and where those sort of ethical boundaries are as well.
Yeah. When we're talking about slightly dirty pool in this case, the phrase fake news, we talk about 2016, it's a term that's been thrown around so much it's lost all meaning. But this week, the accusation's been levelled at the Harris campaign. It all stems from these campaign ads that appear at the top of Google search results for Kamala Harris. While they do clearly say that they're sponsored, they also look very much like links to news articles with a headline and an excerpt from a news story. The problem is, while they are real links to real news articles, those aren't the original headlines or excerpts from the original news articles. Those headlines have been changed by the Harris campaign. They paid to do that. Now, while Google says that this is common practice for advertisers and doesn't violate their rules, in 2019, Facebook banned the ability for advertisers to edit the text of news links with their ads as part of their efforts to stop misinformation and fake news. Now, my personal view is that Facebook was right to stop this behaviour. I think a casual reader would naturally assume that these were direct quotes from a newspaper that they trust, especially if they don't click on the link, which most people don't. To quote allsides.com, which is where I pilfered this story from, it blurs the line between campaign ads and news content, and it falsely implies endorsement from a news site. So it's not quite fake news, John, and it's definitely legal, no doubt about that. But honestly, I do not think this is a positive development. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree with you and all sides on this. I think it is ethically murky. If it is something that will tend to mislead the casual viewer, then you should not be doing it. And they don't need to do it. There is a lot of very positive news stories out there about Kamala Harris at the moment. You don't need to juice the headlines. And ultimately, you know, even if you go through to the link and you see the original story with the original headline, rather than going to a Harris website that just has a bit of the text under their headline. I mean, but as soon as you start tinkering editorially with content, then people lose faith in, is this a genuine Washington Post article or is it not? They don't need to be doing this. And, you know, while there's a certain amount of hypocrisy, no doubt, in the way that Trump is going on about how this is fake news and this is making up endorsements and everything else. It's not doing that either. And most people, obviously, they can tell when something is sponsored and they kind of scan over, and if they're interested, well, they're probably positive towards Kamala anyway. So if they're seeing a positive headline, they click on it, they see a positive story, they're happy, you know. So I don't think, you know, anyone loses here except that it just chips away at the standards that we should be applying.
I agree about the chipping away. I think the thing I find most insidious about it, I don't want to sell this too hard because, like we said, it's marked and all the rest of it. But the thing I find most insidious about it is that it is when you search Kamala Harris, and they only use left-wing publications. Like they only use The Guardian, like the New York Times, publications that a Democrat would trust. So what that means is, if they are just flicking past it, they care if the New York Times endorses Kamala Harris.
Right.
Like if this was a right-winger looking at that, they don't give a stuff what the New York Times thinks. But they are pitching this precisely to the people who would care what those newspapers think. And so they're kind of borrowing that newspaper's reputation.
They are, yeah.
And the newspaper isn't even taking money out of this. It's Google that's taking money out of this. The New York Times is having its reputation mortgaged amongst its readers without even taking a cent out of it. So it actually screws over these publications. They've spent sometimes hundreds of years building up a reputation, being exploited by the campaign. And that's the thing that I find the dodgiest of all.
Well, while we're on the broad subject of media accessibility, truth in media, and other related topics, Former President Trump gave what was billed as a press conference at his golf resort at Bedminster in New Jersey earlier today. It was in front of the most White House-looking white columns he could possibly find. He was flanked by flags and tables of groceries, including breakfast cereal and cans of instant coffee whose prices have all risen as a result of inflation in recent years. Trump then gave, in this press conference, a 45-minute monologue, which is a partially scripted version of his usual stump speech, before he took his first question. He then took questions for another hour or so. Each of his answers, though, were basically not addressing the question. He just used a key word as a prompt to then discuss another topic for about 10 or 15 minutes. There was not a lot of accountability. About the only new thing we learned in all of this was, well, it had been quite some time since Donald Trump had Cheerios for breakfast.
But look at this over here. What a nice job. I think I'm going to take some of them back to my cottage and have a lot of fun. Like the Cheerios. I haven't seen Cheerios in a long time. I'm going to take them back with me. Bacon is through the roof. They're all through the roof. The milk, everything is bad. And we're going to straighten it out. We're going to bring prices way down, and we'll get it done fast. And with her, it's just talk. She's a radical left San Francisco person who destroyed the place. And I don't know. It's hard to believe that she can even be in the discussion.
It was quite the press conference. For more, I spoke a little earlier to Benjy Sarlin. He's covered the last two presidential campaigns for the NBC network in the United States. These days, he's the Washington bureau chief for Semafor. It's hard to know what's worse, having no press conferences at all or having a press conference like Donald Trump had earlier today. What's your view on the relative merits?
I think it's always worthwhile grilling a candidate. And this is a very Trump-specific argument that we've really been having for the last 10 years in the United States. Is it worth it to give him airtime, to quote-unquote platform him? How seriously should we take him if, for example, there was a fact check, I believe, by NPR of his previous press conference that I think found 162 distortions or lies or misstatements. Is it really valuable to the public if that's going to be the kind of press conference you get? I think it is, as long as it is appropriately covered, as long as there are well-constructed questions that bring out something interesting about a candidate that are sometimes difficult to evade, where even an evasive answer tells you something about the candidate, whether or not they're truly getting at what voters are interested and what the public is interested. Our own reporter just interviewed Donald Trump on stage at the National Association of Black Journalists just a few weeks ago, and I thought got some pretty interesting answers on topics that he's not normally asked about. Like, for example, reforms to prevent abuse by police, something he discusses sometimes but rarely goes into detail or considers the full implications of, perhaps. So in general, I am pro press conference. Go out, ask questions. You'll get some bad questions. We certainly had some at the press conference earlier. But in general, more access, better is my approach.
When it comes to that question of who gets access to a press conference, who is regarded as press these days, there were some pretty embarrassing softballs being lobbed at Donald Trump from some of the reporters there. There were other perfectly reasonable questions as well. Should there be kind of limits on who is kind of credentialed to go to these things, or is that impinging free speech?
I mean, in general, the press should always be advocating for themselves. They should be trying to get the most kinds of outlets. They should be trying to get outlets that have an ideological bent on the left, on the right, those that are more relatively nonpartisan. And in general, I don't think there's anything wrong with, for example, candidates speaking to ideologically friendly news outlets. I think the problems you run into is when they just are contained there. I mean, sometimes the most interesting questions you get, and sometimes when candidates say the most revealing things, is when they're caught off guard by a friendly news interviewer who's perhaps trying to goad them into saying something that their friends are excited about that maybe other voters are perhaps less excited about. We're seeing this happen a lot with JD Vance right now, for example, Trump's running mate, where a lot of his older interviews with kind of very, very hardline conservative outlets are being resurfaced, in which he said some pretty revealing things, I would argue. But in general, yes, I mean, the press should be advocating for access. The kinds of press events where you very carefully handpick who is talking to you, obviously, it's not ideal.
Benjy, clearly campaigns want to control the message, control the narrative, to decide what their campaign is about, the things that they're talking about. How do you match that up, therefore, with the very reasonable questions that voters and journalists have about what is going to be your policy on X or Y, or how different are you from the incumbent administration, and so on? What is reasonable, do you think, for campaigns to kind of land on as a compromise there?
Well, I don't think there's exactly one answer, but in general, if there is serious pressing topics hanging over your campaign that you have not answered, especially, there needs to be some reasonable mechanism by which you are regularly updating the public, getting questions, moving past them, and moving on to the next topic. So to get to Kamala Harris, as I'm sure we'll discuss a bit, this is someone who just became the nominee for president, presumptively about 20 days ago or so, in a unprecedented switch in the middle of a campaign. So needless to say, there is a long list of basic questions about who are you? How are you different than the current president? What are you running on? How would you govern? What is your approach? Is the job different of being president than the way you've approached it as vice president? Would you act differently if put in that position instead, or would you mostly carry over what you've been doing with the current administration? There's just an extremely long list of burning questions. So on the one hand, you could make the argument, as you often hear from Kamala Harris supporters, by the way, which is, look, they have ways of speaking directly to the public. This isn't the old days of mass media. They can go through social media. They can put on their own events that are widely broadcast on live streams. They don't even need the cable news networks to carry them to reach a global audience. And they can get to these questions when they want, especially given that, they just inherited a new campaign out of nowhere about 3 weeks ago, and they're also trying to get themselves set up. They may need time to answer some of these questions. And I understand that. But I do think there's a basic absurdity here in trying to go too long. We only have 80 days now before Americans choose the next president, and voting is actually going to begin in many states significantly sooner than that. I think you can't go too long without submitting to some questions that are outside your control, and then get to some fundamental issues about what exactly you are running on and what you plan to do.
But Benjy, we find ourselves, don't we, in a little bit of a bizarro world where for a candidate like Trump to stand there and lie 100 times in a press conference, everyone goes, oh, well, no news in that. We've known that for best part of a decade. Whereas if Kamala Harris were to sit down right now and answer a bunch of the very reasonable questions that you suggest there about what her policies are going to be, the truly honest answer is, dude, I only just found out that I was going to be maybe, running for president this year. I don't know yet. I just met Tim Walz. That seems to be going well. We're doing rallies together, but as to, we got a lot of work to do on policies, and we haven't had time to sketch that out yet.
People often suggest that to me when I bring this topic up, to which I say, yeah, you can say that in an interview. Like, what? There's no reason you can't level with the American people.
But then the headline's going to be, Harris admits she doesn't know what she's going to do on climate. Harris admits she doesn't know what she's going to do on Ukraine. That would be damaging to her campaign. That's the problem, I guess I'm suggesting, is to be truthful is the bigger liability at the moment.
It depends. These are tensions that exist within every campaign and in every politics and their relationship with the press. I will say there are sort of two different questions. One, is it politically savvy to do a news interview, which I think is a separate question. And obviously, when campaigns are doing well, is often when they feel they can ignore the press. And, Donald Trump is doing press conferences now because he's trying to bait Harris into doing them. But he can go extremely long stretches without significant interviews with, without an extremely friendly outlet doing the questions. That's happened before, too. So obviously, there is a case that Kamala Harris is better off politically now, where she has all this momentum. She's surging in the polls. Why spoil it with things like questions? It's possible, but I do think it's the press's job to not take that perspective, because it's not our job to get Kamala Harris elected. It's our job to ask pressing questions on behalf of the public in a democracy ahead of an election. And look, I get it can be annoying when I hear Democrats say, look, we know enough about her, right? She was Joe Biden's vice president. She probably will be relatively similar. And she's not Donald Trump, who is extremely different, as you said, and is judged by a very different standard. Why bother with this? I get that's annoying. The press's one superpower we can do to get access is be annoying and just raise the question. And, right before I came on, Tim Walz was in Colorado for a fundraiser, and he did not stop to take questions. And I noticed the local news anchor, just one of those local news outlets, not someone who's a national name, mentioned, we understand we're not a competitive state in this election, that it's expected to go for Harris, but we requested an interview. We hoped the press might get questions to him at this event. He took no questions. And we just want you to know that we asked for that access, and we're going to keep asking whenever they're in the state. I don't think it's too much to say that and at least remind people that you're missing out on something when politicians, for example, come to your state and don't answer questions from the local media about issues that are important locally. You don't have to be grandiose about it and accuse people of subverting democracy every time they won't, go up to your microphone. But I don't think there's anything wrong with the press advocating for access. It's just this is a democracy. The fourth estate matters.
How unique is this situation now, Benjy? Because obviously we did not have that traditional 12 to 18 month primary process where, the press pack is following, whether it's Kamala Harris or whoever, to every diner and pizza shop and coffee clutch in Iowa and New Hampshire, and hearing the same thing time after time. The candidate gets very well practiced in what the questions are going to be and what the answers are going to be, and everyone gets kind of sick of hearing it, so the pressure is off. It's like, I don't need to hear this again.
Which is, by the way, one of the reasons that candidates often end up doing interviews, or candidates who avoid interviews often understanding that they perhaps made a mistake, which is that you end up with a buildup of burning questions you sort of need to get out of the way, and it just becomes a pent-up thing, and then it becomes harder and harder to do it because you're expecting more and more hostile questions and more difficult topics. Whereas candidates that talk more regular, like you said, even on very controversial questions, sometimes it's no longer news even when they're asked about them because we feel like we understand their position. So an example you gave was Trump right there, right? In his press conference, yes, he said a lot of perhaps inflammatory things, perhaps some false things, but the vast majority of it was frankly things we've heard before. In many cases, things we've heard many times before. It was answers I could memorize, riffs he's been doing in some case for 5, 6, 7, 8 years even. We know Trump very well in a lot of respects at this point. And as a result, it often makes less news when he says some of these things, just because it's so well established. So yes, there is a balance here. The more press you do, the more you are able to perhaps move on to other topics without certain ones weighing on you so much. But to get to another question you raised, Kamala Harris ran for president before and did go through that process where I talked to her campaign, wrote questions for her. Many reporters did. She had to put out detailed policy papers. And one reason we're kind of dying to talk to her is that a lot of the positions she took were significantly to the left of Joe Biden. And we understand since then, obviously, Joe Biden was more moderate. She elected to be his vice president. She was very loyal, stuck by his side, supported the administration's policies. And we're starting to hear indirectly on background through spokesmen that she's abandoned some of those positions. I don't think it's too much to ask, okay, what changed? Like, did you change your overall philosophy towards government? Did you decide some of these discrete positions were wrong? Does this inform how you would govern going forward? How would you make policy decisions going forward? Who would you consult? What factors would you take into account? Are you talking to the same advisors that you were talking to then when you took positions that were different than the ones you have now? I don't think these are radically hostile questions, but at some point you are going to need to address them, and before you can move on to the next set of things you're going to want to talk about.
The last month or two in American politics has been an absolute whirlwind, from the train wreck debate for Biden, Trump's shooting, to the Republican convention, the announcement of JD Vance as Trump's running mate, Joe Biden's decision not to run again, Kamala Harris securing the Democratic nomination, Tim Walz joining the ticket last week, and then this dramatic shift in enthusiasm and the polls all in favour of the Democrats. In the days after Biden endorsed Vice President Harris to become the Democratic nominee, she was less than 1 point in front of Trump in the average national polls, whereas Biden had been behind. This week, Harris leads by 3 points. And enthusiasm amongst Democrats has also surged in recent weeks. Before Biden's fateful debate, just 46% of Democrats were saying they were enthusiastic about the election, compared to 71% of Republicans. Now, 85% of Democrats are enthusiastic, while Republican enthusiasm has stayed the same, 71%. And look at that as well, independent enthusiasm, it has also bounced almost 20 points in that time. So some good signs for Kamala Harris and the Democrats. And Trump hasn't really been taking it very well, lashing out on social media and basically denying the new reality.
I'm doing really well in the presidential race, leading in almost all of the real polls, and this despite the Democrats unprecedentedly changing their primary winning candidate, Sleepy Joe Biden, midstream. We are going to win big and take our country back from the radical left losers, fascists, and communists.
And while all that's been going on, Trump has been keeping a surprisingly light campaign schedule. And there's a bit of a sense that he's now falling back on some of his tried and true material, the greatest hits, while he struggles to come up with new lines of attack against Harris.
Kamala, you're fired. Get out of here. Go. Get out of here. Get out.
Ooh. I don't know about you.
I've got a finger.
Yeah. In recent weeks, at the one rally and the couple of press conferences, Trump has seemed less like Trump than a Trump impersonator. He seems to be reverting to a lot of his old tricks, his old tactics, his old lines, his old attacks. It really does feel like a greatest hits compilation. While he's sort of struggling to write new material out the back, he's just playing the old chart toppers.
Well, it's a tough situation he's in. Everything he's trying is not working. It's like we've just been talking about the Kamala Harris science strategy, but the thing I actually found most interesting in the last week was when she turned up for the 71 seconds at that airport and took some questions.
Yeah.
And they fired off about 7 questions in 71 seconds. She gave one-line answers to every single one of them. And she gave them nothing more than she needed to say. She just gave the most basic possible answer. I thought, if this is a sign of what's to come, Trump would be in a panic, because that kind of discipline, number one, is not what she showed in 2019. So it shows that she's learnt.
Yeah.
And number two, it's something he's not capable of matching. He does not have that discipline. This is what you're talking about. We're seeing a real lack of discipline in his campaign. And so I could see that making him really nervous.
What is it about Trump? Because it did seem, I mean, obviously it was partly in contrast to Joe Biden's very problematic performance in that debate, but Trump did seem more disciplined in that debate. It wasn't objectively a great performance by Trump, but there were times where you thought, hey, that was a good answer. That didn't ramble, that was concise, that was clean, it seemed well enough rehearsed and on message. When he was winning, he seemed like a better candidate. Now he's losing, even though he denies that he's losing. The only two national polls this week, I think, that had him in front were both from Rasmussen. And there was a Fox News poll as well. But there were about 10 or 12 others that all had Harris in front of the swing states as well. So he's in public denial, saying all these polls are rigged, oversampling Democrats, but clearly he's rattled. And clearly he's still just trying this scattergun approach, even though his campaign, they know, Chris LaCivita and Susie Wiles, they know the thing that sticks with Kamala Harris is that she's liberal. She's too liberal. She's too progressive. Just keep saying that.
Yeah, keep talking at the border.
But instead he talks about Kamala Harris. Who is she? Nobody even knows her last name. It's like, sorry?
Yeah.
People don't know Kamala Harris's last name? I'm pretty sure they do. Just because you don't know how to pronounce her first name doesn't mean the rest of America doesn't know her last name. It makes no logical sense, and there's no strategy behind it.
Yeah, he's under a lot of pressure. You're comparing him to the debate. He wasn't under pressure in the debate. Most people would consider themselves under pressure in a debate, but he knew he had Joe Biden completely taken care of. Whereas now, I don't think he knows exactly how to approach. The fact he keeps on changing his line every time he goes out there is an indication he doesn't know what line he should be delivering. He's just trying anything. And I'm not sure if I've mentioned this on on our show or just on the podcast. I've definitely mentioned this somewhere, but I think the Kamala Harris rallies are having a serious impact on his psychology. I think that, I mean, I don't want to be a psychologist here, I'm not, but I genuinely think that Donald Trump evaluates his self-worth based on how popular he perceives himself to be. And he perceives himself to be popular based on numbers. How many people showed up? How many people liked my tweet? How many people watched my conversation with Elon Musk? If he doesn't get a number he likes, he makes up a number he likes. But it's not like he doesn't know he's making up that number, right? And I think that deep down, he knows that she is smashing him on the numbers that he cares about, which are the people who show up at rallies. And I don't think he knows what to do with that. And I think it's making him desperate. And
history says that the last time Donald Trump saw his ratings declining like this was when he was worried The Apprentice was going to be cancelled, so he ran for president as a branding exercise just to try and boost that. So he will try some sort of left field tactics. But for more on what is going on with Trump's campaign to return to the White House, we spoke to Ying Ma. She's a former member of the Council on Foreign Relations and a top advisor to Republican candidates, including the likes of Dr. Ben Carson in 2016. And like Ben Carson now, she has become a major supporter of Donald Trump. So there has been a lot of criticism of the Trump campaign strategy really ever since the Republican convention. What have you made of the fact that he's given, one rally in 2 weeks, a couple of press conferences that were basically 45-minute stump speeches with a few questions, and then that chat with Elon Musk the other day? Is that a good strategy?
Well, I think the Trump campaign obviously has had to reset, and it's difficult for every campaign to have to all of a sudden fight against a completely different opponent. So I think a lot of the hiccups are completely understandable. I'm not quite sure why Trump's schedule has been so light. I have wondered whether it had anything to do with his recovery from the assassination attempt, but I don't have any inside information on that. So I don't know. But he's done a lot of interviews, even though he hasn't been out at the rallies as much. Don't forget that he went to that interview with the National Association of Black Journalists, and Kamala Harris, his opponent, was invited to the same event, and it would have been a far friendlier venue for her. And she didn't show. In fact, she hasn't done any interviews since she became the nominee of the Democratic Party.
Now, you mentioned how Trump is running against the Biden-Harris administration. Well, Kamala Harris seems to be also running against the Biden-Harris administration as a candidate of change, almost like she's not a part of the administration at all. And at least so far, the polls suggest she's getting away with it. So do you think she can get away with that in the long run?
It's crucial for the Trump campaign to remind everybody that this woman has been in office with Biden for the last 3.5 years. She keeps talking about, well, when I become president, I'm going to do X. And, when I become president, I'm going to do Y. Why didn't she do any of that in the last 3.5 years? And why doesn't she do any of those things now? She's still in office. So there's a lot of absurdity, and there's just a lot of phony rhetoric. But I think what Trump needs to do a lot more, and he needs to keep doing this before the end of this campaign season, is to go talk to independent media. And I'm talking about the podcasters, the influencers. And so one example of that would be podcaster Joe Rogan, who has the most popular podcast in the entire world. Because what you do is you bypass the mainstream media that hates the Trump campaign, that hates Donald Trump. You bypass them altogether, and you take your message directly to the people. It's a little bit like a Trump rally, except people don't have to show up in Butler, Pennsylvania, or Milwaukee, Michigan, or wherever it is. They don't need to show up in person and line up for 6 hours to go see Trump speak. They can see Trump speak to one of their favorite anchors, podcasters, online, on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify. And that's what Trump, I think, needs to do much more often. He needs to continue spending money on advertising, because that's crucial in any campaign. But I think the media landscape has changed quite a bit since we last talked, and I think the Trump campaign needs to take advantage of that.
Ying, does any of Trump's recent behaviour concern you? I mean, he seems to me to be behaving quite erratically online recently. I'm referring to Trump wish-casting that Biden will return, and also that Harris rallies are AI generated, for example. Does that concern you?
Well, obviously it would be more convenient for Trump if Biden were to return, but he knows that's not going to happen. I don't think that concerns me. I think it's just how Trump talks. He tends to ramble a lot, and and he's not scripted, as you guys have observed over these years. I do think that he's upset, obviously, that he had expected to run against one candidate and he was doing so well, and then all of a sudden he's no longer running against that candidate, right? So I don't blame him for being upset, but and I don't remember who he was talking to when he made that comment about Biden, but I find a lot of Trump's comments highly humorous because it's so off the cuff, and he kind of says what's on his mind. But his campaign knows, and he knows that Biden's not going to stick around or come back, and so Kamala Harris is his opponent, and that's the person, and it's not just Kamala now. Kamala has a running mate, and who's also a disaster in his own right, and so these are the two people the campaign and Trump would need to attack very aggressively, and I think they are doing that.
Ying, you were in Conservative and Republican politics for years before Donald Trump came along. You have been a staunch Trump supporter during his time in office and as a candidate again now. But what about in the Trump era? If he loses this election, where does the Republican Party go? And does Trumpism end with Trump?
I think it'll depend heavily on whether Trump wins or not, because obviously his legacy would be on far firmer ground if he wins. If he loses, I think there's going to be a lot of bickering within the GOP about why he lost, and those who hate him, the never Trumpers, are going to say it's Trump's personality, Trump's policies, his populist agenda, all that, and so there will be a lot of recrimination. Now, what I've been most disappointed by is actually men and women who claim to be conservatives, men and women who secretly hate Trump, are some of the most sycophantic of Trump. And what did where did these people go in the last administration, the last Trump administrations? They served in some of the highest cabinet positions, or maybe just a tier below. And they were infesting that administration actually from top to bottom. And that's actually one of the most grotesque things I've seen through my years of working in conservative policy and politics, that it is all of these people who have been claiming all their lives how conservative they are, that these are men and women without convictions, without honor. They hated Donald Trump secretly, but some of them openly said so. And then when he won, they went and pledged their fealty, their loyalty to him. And then as soon as there was trouble, they came out in the press saying, that they hated him all along. And these were the people who actively undermined Donald Trump's agenda, foreign policy, domestic policy. And I think these people, for the most part, have never been held to account. And I think some of them are going to run for president in 2028. And so we will see how that pans out. I hope very much that Trump will win in November. If for some reason he doesn't, I think that this debate, this policy debate in the Republican Party is going to have to happen.
Ying Ma, good to talk to you again. Thanks for having a fireside chat.
Thank you both. Great to chat with you.
Now, you were itching to make one last point before we went to that interview. What was it?
What it was that we are just about to hit the Democrat convention. Let's assume that they are competent and they run a proper convention. She'll probably get a bounce out of that. Yeah. So then Trump will be even more desperate. But then we are on the runway to the debate.
Yes.
Right? And Kamala Harris will only have, we're talking about, she might do some interviews afterwards. She's not going to have time to do interviews afterwards. She's going to have to start preparing for her debate. She'll have maybe a week of campaigning, and then it'll be debate time, which means we're going to get all the way up to mail-in votes on the debate. The debate is going to be so important. It's going to be so much more important than any other debate, with the exception of the last one that drove out the president. But it is going to be so important, this debate. Yep. Trump, we've seen already in this campaign, something like Trump got shot. 2 weeks later, we've forgotten it.
Yeah.
All right, like that debate is going to be absolutely massive.
Yep.
And it will change potentially everything we've seen up to now. So if I was Trump, he just needs to hang in there and have a good debate.
Yes.
It could change everything. Kamala Harris's supporters should not get cocky.
Yeah, that's true. The DNC next week is the last controlled environment she has until Election Day, because things get very real and very willing after that. You're right. But that is all the time we have for another Fireside Chat. Next week it is the DNC in Chicago, Illinois. We'll tell you all about it at the same time next week.
And don't forget Planet America on Wednesday on ABC TV, and also the Pet Podcast is up in all the very best pod places.
Bye-bye.